In the 1800s, there were no alarm clocks buzzing on bedside tables, no phone screens lighting up with morning reminders. Instead, the world woke slowly, in rhythm with nature. In rural areas, the day began with the crow of a rooster echoing across quiet fields. For centuries, that sharp sound had been the farmer's faithful signal to rise. But in the growing towns and cities of the 19th century, another figure took on that duty. A knocker-upper was a human alarm clock. With a long stick or a pole, they walked the streets before dawn, tapping on windows to wake sleeping workers. Some used small pea shooters to reach higher windows. People paid a few pence a week for this service, relying on it to make it to factory shifts or bakery jobs that started before the sun came up. Missing your wake-up call could mean losing a day's wages, or worse, your job. So people trusted these early risers more than their own internal clocks. There was no snooze button, no second chances, just the tap of a stick on glass or the familiar crow from the yard. The 1800s version of rise and shine, long before the sun peeked over the hills. Life in the 1800s was already in motion. Morning chores weren't just tasks, they were woven into survival. As soon as someone stirred from bed, the day's labor began. In farming families, every member had a role, even the youngest. Before breakfast, before school, there were animals to feed and fires to light. Milking the cows was often the first task. You'd wrap yourself in a shawl or coat, step into the frost-tipped barn, and sit beside the gentle creature, your hands freezing against the metal pail. Chickens needed feeding, and their eggs carefully collected, sometimes from hiding spots. Pigs were slopped with yesterday's scraps. It was messy, smelly, and necessary. If the family relied on a wood-burning stove, and most did, someone had to chop kindling or carry in logs. Water had to be drawn from a well, sometimes in total darkness, then lugged inside for cooking, washing, and cleaning. It was heavy, tiring work, and it happened every single day, rain, snow, or shine. By the time sunlight spilled through the window panes, children had already worked an hour or more. Life in the 1800s didn't wait for sunrise, it beat it. In the 1800s, the word bathroom didn't mean what it does today. For most people, especially in rural areas, there was no indoor plumbing, no flush toilets, and no warm, tiled washrooms. Instead, personal needs were met with a bit of creativity and a lot of tolerance. At night, people used chamber pots, ceramic or metal bowls kept under the bed or behind curtains. On cold nights, especially in winter, no one wanted to trudge outside to an outhouse. The chamber pot, though far from glamorous, was the most convenient option. In the morning, it was someone's job, often a child's, to empty and clean it. During the day, people used outhouses, small wooden structures set back from the house, with a single wooden seat over a deep hole. The smell was nearly unbearable in summer, and the cold nearly unbearable in winter. Still, it was just part of daily life. Bathing was a separate ordeal entirely. Water had to be drawn from the well, heated on the stove, and poured into a metal tub. Most families bathed once a week, if that, and often used the same bathwater, one after the other. Cleanliness was a luxury, not a given. Taking a bath in the 1800s was nothing like it is today. There were no steamy showers or tubs filled with fragrant bubbles. In most homes, especially in rural areas, bathing was a carefully planned event, one that required time, effort, and a lot of patience. First, water had to be drawn from a well or pump, one heavy bucket at a time. Then it was heated on the wood-burning stove, slowly and steadily, often taking hours to prepare enough for a bath. Once warm, the water was poured into a large metal washtub, sometimes placed in the kitchen, where the fire kept things warm. Bath night was usually Saturday, right before church on Sunday, and it wasn't a solo event. Families shared the same water, starting with the father, then the mother, followed by the children in order from oldest to youngest. By the end, the water was more grey than clean, but it didn't go to waste. Soap was often homemade, harsh, and made from lye and animal fat. It stung the eyes and dried the skin, but it got the job done. For many, this weekly ritual was the closest they came to feeling truly clean. In the 1800s, Saturday night wasn't for going out, it was for getting clean. Bath night, as it was commonly called, was a weekly tradition, often taking place in the warmth of the kitchen where the stove glowed and the fire crackled. It wasn't a relaxing soak with candles and soft music. No, it was practical, chilly, and sometimes a little bit gross, but it was what people did. Once the water had been hauled in, heated on the stove, and poured into the wash tub, the order of bathing began. Typically, the father went first, followed by the mother, then the children, oldest to youngest. By the time the youngest climbed in, the water was cloudy, lukewarm, and not exactly inviting. But that's just how it was. The same bar of lye soap was used by all, and there were no fluffy towels or soft robes, just a cloth and a quick dry-off by the hearth. Bathing was less about luxury and more about duty. It was part of preparing for Sunday, the cleanest day of the week, when families dressed in their best and made their way to church, fresh or as fresh as the week allowed. In the 1800s, brushing your teeth wasn't a morning ritual involving peppermint paste and ergonomic toothbrushes. Dental hygiene was basic, often homemade, and sometimes a bit abrasive literally. Most people used a simple mixture of crushed charcoal, chalk, salt, or baking soda to scrub their teeth clean. The gritty powder was rubbed onto a damp cloth or, if you were lucky, a stiff bristled brush made from animal bone or wood with coarse boar hair. Toothpaste as we know it today hadn't yet been invented. Instead, people mixed their own powders at home or bought them in little tins from the local apothecary. The taste was harsh, nothing sweet or minty about it, but it left your mouth feeling clean in a raw, squeaky kind of way. Toothbrushes weren't replaced regularly, and many families shared one brush between members, rinsing it in cold water between uses. Cavities were common, but treatment was primitive. A toothache often meant a visit to the barber, who doubled as a dentist, and the only solution was removal, no numbing, just a strong grip in a pair of forceps. People smiled less in portraits back then, and perhaps now you understand why. In the 1800s, a woman's silhouette wasn't just about fashion, it was a symbol of virtue, elegance, and social standing, and at the center of that image was the corset. From a young age, girls were introduced to these tightly laced garments, designed to mold the body into the fashionable hourglass shape of the time. A tiny waist, rounded hips, and lifted bust. Corsets were made of stiff whalebone or metal stays, stitched into heavy fabric and laced in the back. Each morning, women would pull the strings tight or enlist someone else to do it until they could barely breathe. The tighter the lacing, the more respectable the appearance. A 17-inch waist was considered the pinnacle of beauty, but beauty came at a cost. Corsets often caused fainting spells, not from delicate emotions but from restricted lungs and compressed organs. Some women even had difficulty eating or sitting comfortably. Yet despite the discomfort, they wore them daily, from sunrise to bedtime. To remove one's corset in public, even briefly, was scandalous. A woman was expected to maintain poise and posture at all times. Behind every graceful nod and gloved hand was a ribcage held hostage by fashion. If you've ever read an old novel or watched a period drama, you've probably seen a woman swoon gently collapsing onto a couch or being caught in a dashing gentleman SRMs. But fainting in the 1800s wasn't always about shock or romantic More often, it was a simple matter of physics and fashion. Tightly laced corsets, combined with heavy gowns, layers of petticoats, and the pressure of perfect posture, meant that women's breathing was quite literally restricted. Even sitting upright for long hours could lead to dizziness in crowded ballrooms, under flickering gas lamps and sweltering heat. It wasn't unusual for a woman to faint from lack of fresh air and circulation. Some upper-class homes even had special furniture called fainting couches, elegant pieces with one raised side where a woman could recover her composure and her breath. It became so common that a graceful faint was almost seen as a sign of refinement. Of course, not all women accepted this quietly. Some loosened their corsets when no one was looking, and others simply refused the tightest trends. But for many, fainting wasn't a weakness, it was the price they paid for being seen as a lady. In the 1800s, modesty wasn't just encouraged, it was a strict social code, especially for women. Clothing covered nearly every inch of the body, from the collarbone to the floor. Sleeves reached wrists, skirts brushed the ground, and even summer dresses were layered with petticoats and bloomers underneath. The idea was simple. A proper lady did not expose skin, especially not her legs, and of all the body parts that caused a stir, none were more scandalous than the ankle. A brief glimpse of a woman's ankle, whether from a gust of wind or a misstep on stairs, could ignite gossip for weeks. It wasn't too uncommon for men to glance downward as a lady boarded a carriage or crossed the street, hoping for a forbidden peek. Some women learned to navigate the world with grace, lifting their skirts just enough to avoid the dirt, but never enough to reveal too much. Fashion responded by creating ankle boots and decorative stockings, hidden beauty just for the wearer, or perhaps a trusted suitor. But still, the rule stood firm. Show too much, and your reputation could unravel faster than a frayed hem. In the 1800s, modesty wasn't just a virtue, it was protection. In the 1800s, childhood was often brief, especially for those born into working-class families. There were no playgrounds, no cartoons, and certainly no lazy summer days. Instead, many children found themselves waking before dawn to earn a living, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Poverty didn't ask if you were old enough to work. It simply demanded. Children as young as 5 were sent to factories, mines, and even dangerous chimneys. In textile mills, small hands were useful for repairing threads and crawling under moving machines. In coal mines, boys carried heavy loads through dark tunnels, barely tall enough to stand in. And chimney sweeps, often orphaned boys, were lowered into soot-filled flues to clean them from the inside, sometimes getting stuck or badly burned. Education was a luxury most couldn't afford. Work hours could stretch 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Pay was meager, and conditions were harsh, but families needed every penny. Still, in the cracks between shifts, childhood sometimes emerged: a game of marbles in the dirt, a stolen smile, a shared crust of bread. In the hardest places, children found a way to remain children, if only for a moment. In the 1800s, Sunday wasn't just a day, it was a rhythm, a pause in a relentless march of time. While every other day was filled with chores, labor, and survival, Sunday stood apart. It was the Sabbath, a sacred day of rest and reflection, woven deeply into the lives of people across towns and villages. Shops closed their shutters, tools were set aside, work paused, even for those who never had time to rest. Families rose early, dressed in their cleanest clothes, often worn only once a week, and made their way to church. It could be a long walk down dusty or muddy roads, sometimes several miles, but it was a journey taken with quiet reverence. Church was more than prayer. It was the heart of the community. Neighbors exchanged greetings, children sat stiffly in pews, and hymns filled the air like a gentle balm. Afterward, there might be a simple meal at home: bread, soup, maybe pie if the week had been kind, followed by quiet time, storytelling, or reading the family Bible. Laughter was subdued, play was minimal, and rest was sacred. Sunday reminded everyone that even in a life of struggle, the soul deserved peace. In the 1800s, if you wanted to send a message to someone far away, you didn't pick up a phone, you picked up a pen. Letters were the heartbeat of long-distance connection. Every emotion, every story, every piece of news was folded into pages and sent off into the world, carried by horse-drawn carriage, rail, or ship. And the weight that could take weeks, even months. People chose their words carefully. Ink was precious, paper wasn't wasted, and there was no backspace. Each letter was written with thought and patience, often in looping cursive, sealed with wax or tied with string. If you were lucky, the letter made it across rivers, mountains, and borders to the hands of a loved one: a sister across the ocean, a soldier on the battlefield, a sweetheart in another town. The arrival of a letter was an event. People would read it aloud by candlelight, sometimes again and again, savoring each word like a treasure. Some tucked them into wooden boxes or pressed them between pages of books, keeping them for years. Letters didn't just deliver messages, they carried love, grief, longing, and joy, fragments of a life lived at a slower, deeper pace. In the 1800s, nighttime wasn't a single stretch of rest the way it is today. Instead, many people slept in 2 distinct parts, a forgotten rhythm once common across the world. It was called segmented sleep. Families would go to bed shortly after dark, around 8 or 9 p.m., and sleep for a few hours, what they called first sleep. Then, like clockwork, many would wake in the middle of the night, not in panic, but peacefully, for what was called the watch. This quiet interlude, usually lasting 1 to 2 hours, was a time for gentle activities. Some prayed, others read the Bible, stoked the fire, or even visited neighbors. In rural areas, it wasn't unusual to see a candle flickering in a neighbor's window during these hours. Afterward, they returned to bed for their second sleep, resting until dawn. This pattern was shaped by the natural cycle of light and darkness in a world without electricity. People listened to their bodies, rising when they stirred and sleeping again when tiredness returned. It was a slower life, quieter, more in tune with the turning earth, and in those midnight hours, the world felt softer, safer, and deeply still. In the 1800s, for most people, the world was small not because the globe was any different, but because their lives rarely extended beyond the horizon. It was common for someone to be born, grow up, marry, work, and die within a 20-mile radius of the same patch of earth. Horses and walking were the primary means of travel, and long journeys were expensive, exhausting, and often unnecessary. In rural communities, a neighboring town might feel like a foreign place. People didn't visit casually. They went for specific reasons: a fair, a funeral, a wedding, or the rare trip to market. Roads were rough, dusty in summer, muddy or frozen in winter. A simple journey of 10 miles could take half a day. Because of this, families lived close. Generations often stayed together on the same land. Local gossip, local news, and local customs shaped one's entire sense of the world. To leave your town, really leave, it was a bold act. Some did, chasing dreams or land or love. But for most, life remained deeply rooted. Their world didn't need to be big, it needed to be steady, familiar, and within the reach of a day's walk home. Traveling in the 1800s was less about speed and more about endurance. There were no highways, no smooth rides, and certainly no rest stops with hot coffee and clean bathrooms. Instead, journeys were made in horse-drawn carriages that creaked and swayed along dirt roads, riddled with bumps, rocks, and deep ruts carved by rain and wagon wheels. If you were wealthy, you might ride in a private carriage with padded seats and a driver, but even then, dust filled the air in summer and mud splattered everything in spring. In colder months, passengers bundled up in furs and wool blankets as winds sliced through the wooden frames. For the average traveler, the ride was rougher. Public coaches were cramped, noisy, and jolted with every turn. Stops were infrequent, and inns along the road were often little more than wooden rooms with straw mattresses and shared wash basins. Motion sickness was common, so was the ache of being jostled for hours. Yet there was a strange charm in the rhythm of the horse's hooves, the crunch of wheels on gravel, and the view of open fields stretching for miles. Travel wasn't fast, but it was a journey, and every mile was earned. In the 1800s, the sun dictated the rhythm of life. When it set, the world didn't just dim, it quieted. There were no glowing screens, no electric lights, no nightlife except for the stars. For most families, nightfall signaled one thing: bedtime. Candles were precious. Some households could barely afford to burn more than one at a time. Others saved them for special occasions or emergencies. Oil lamps, while longer lasting, still required fuel, something not everyone could spare. So, when dusk fell and the last chores were done, people often went to bed simply because it was dark. Families gathered by the fireplace in the evenings, talking softly, reading if they could, or working by flickering light to finish mending or knitting. But once the fire burned low, it wasn't worth wasting fuel. Eyes grew heavy, and beds, though cold and simple, became a welcome retreat. In wealthier homes, there might be a few more hours of gentle activity, but for most, nighttime wasn't for entertainment, it was for rest. Sleep came early, not from exhaustion alone, but because the darkness wrapped the world in stillness. And in that stillness, the day quietly came to a close. In today's world, ice is as simple as pressing a button. But in the 1800s, ice was a seasonal wonder, harvested by hand, stored with care, and prized like gold during the warmer months. For many, it was the luxury of the wealthy, a miracle from the north that arrived only if you had the money and the patience. Each winter, in the coldest regions, men with saws and horses would cut thick blocks of ice from frozen lakes and rivers. These shimmering slabs were hauled to giant ice houses, deep pits, or buildings insulated with straw, sawdust, and packed snow. If done correctly, the ice could last well into summer. When shipped southward or into cities, ice was wrapped tightly and transported in wagons or but it wasn't for everyone. Ordinary folks rarely had access to it. Ice was used to cool milk, preserve meat for a few extra days, or in grand homes, chilled drinks for garden parties. A glass of lemonade over ice, that was pure luxury. Children would sometimes gather around the ice wagon, hoping for a chip or sliver, and when they got one, they held it like treasure, cold, rare, and melting far too fast. Before refrigerators hummed in kitchens, Keeping food fresh in the 1800s was a daily battle, one fought with cellars, smoke, salt, and clever hands. There was no electric hum behind a door full of leftovers. Every meal required planning, and preservation was a skill passed down through generations. People used what they had. In colder climates, food was stored in root cellars, cool, dark rooms dug beneath the house or into the earth, where potatoes, onions, carrots, and even barrels of apples could last through winter. Meats were salted, smoked, or dried. Large slabs of pork or beef hung from rafters, blackened by smoke but safely preserved. In towns lucky enough to receive ice, wooden ice boxes helped extend the life of milk, butter, and cheese. A block of ice would be placed in the top compartment, chilling the box below, but it melted quickly and replacements weren't cheap. Women rose early to prepare meals with whatever hadn't spoiled. Leftovers had to be eaten within hours, not days. Nothing was wasted. Even sour milk had its use in baking. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a delicate balance between time, temperature, and tradition. And every bite told a story of effort. In the 1800s, medicine was more mystery than science. Illness was common, and cures were often as strange as the ailments themselves. With no antibiotics, no x-rays, and little understanding of germs, people turned to remedies passed down through folklore, family, and the hands of country doctors. One of the most common treatments. Doctors believed that illness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids, and draining blood would restore harmony. Sometimes they made small incisions with a knife. Other times, they used leeches, slippery, wriggling creatures placed on the skin to suck the sickness away. Painkillers, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, whiskey was used to dull pain, calm nerves, and help sleep. Even children were given teaspoons of spirits mixed with herbs. Another favorite was laudanum, a strong tincture made from opium. Sold over the counter, it was given for everything from toothaches to trouble sleeping. Doctors traveled on horseback with black bags full of bottles, bandages, and bravery. But often, people treated themselves at home, using mustard poultices, vinegar wraps, or prayer. It was a time when healing took faith in remedies, in resilience, and in the body's stubborn will to survive. In the 1800s, raising a baby was as beautiful as it was bewildering, especially when nights stretched long and cries echoed through candlelit rooms. Without modern medicine or parenting guides, families relied on the wisdom of neighbors, midwives, and apothecaries to soothe their little ones. And one of the most commonly reached for solutions was a dark, mysterious liquid, laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture made from opium, often mixed with alcohol. It was sold openly in pharmacies and general stores, and used to treat everything from coughs to colic. For fussy babies who couldn't sleep, it was considered a godsend. A few drops on the tongue could quiet them for hours, sometimes too long. Mothers, worn thin from days of work and sleepless nights, used it sparingly, but sometimes too often. No one yet knew the dangers of addiction, or how such tiny doses could harm a growing body. The goal was rest and silence. In a world where life was already so demanding, babies were swaddled tightly, laid in cradles near the hearth, and rocked by tired hands. In homes filled with love, but lacking answers, laudanum became a whisper in the night, a risky lullaby in a time without better options. In the 1800s, babies were wrapped like little bundles of cloth, snug, secure, and barely able to wiggle. This practice, known as swaddling, wasn't just a passing phase. It was a deeply rooted tradition believed to keep babies safe, calm, and properly shaped. From the moment a child was born, they were wrapped tightly in long strips of cloth, often from shoulders to toes. The belief was that it helped their limbs grow straight, prevented injury, and soothed them by mimicking the warmth of the womb. Some babies stayed swaddled nearly all day, every day for weeks or even months. Mothers would carry these tightly wrapped bundles while going about chores. Cradles sat beside the hearth, gently rocked by foot as mothers sewed or cooked. A quiet baby was considered a well-behaved one, and swaddling helped keep them still, especially in crowded households with multiple children and little time for fussing. Of course, not all babies liked it, and not all families swaddled the same. But in a world without baby monitors or sleep consultants, swaddling offered a sense of control, a way to care with the tools they had. Guided by love, instinct, and the wisdom of generations past. In the 1800s, toys didn't come in bright plastic packaging or with blinking lights and sound effects. There were no batteries to change or buttons to push. Instead, children played with what could be carved, stitched, or imagined. Toys were handmade, sometimes by parents, sometimes by older siblings, and often by the children themselves. A favorite might be a rag doll sewn from scraps of cloth, with button eyes and yarn for hair. Others had carved wooden animals, little trains on strings, or hoops they'd roll along dirt paths with a stick. A corn husk doll or a cloth ball stuffed with wool was enough to bring delight on a quiet afternoon. Boys often crafted slingshots from tree branches or built miniature wagons with spare wood and wheels. Girls treasured their tiny tea sets made of tin or china, if they were lucky, often passed down from mothers or grandmothers. These toys didn't just entertain, they taught care, creativity, and patience. When one broke, it was mended, not thrown away. Play was woven into the rhythms of daily life, often interrupted by chores, but always welcomed. In those small, simple things, joy was found lasting, homemade, and never forgotten. In the 1800s, the sight of a Christmas tree glowing with candlelight was nothing short of magical and a little dangerous. Before electric lights, families carefully clipped real candles to the tree branches using tiny metal holders or even melted wax. The glow was warm and soft, flickering across homemade ornaments and tinsel made from strips of silver or tin. Because of the fire risk, candles were lit for only a few minutes at a time, often under strict supervision, with a bucket of water or sand nearby just in case. Children watched in wide-eyed wonder, knowing it was a fleeting moment of beauty. Trees were often decorated with fruits, nuts, cookies, and paper garlands. In simpler homes, a small pine or spruce might be placed on a table rather than the floor. The scent of evergreen mixed with the smells of gingerbread and wood smoke, creating a memory that lingered long after the candles were blown out. It wasn't just about light, it was about gathering, pausing, and feeling something sacred in the darkest part of the year. For many, the Christmas tree wasn't just decoration, it was a shining reminder of hope, warmth, and togetherness. In the 1800s, a Christmas gift didn't need to be wrapped in shiny paper or stacked under a tree. For many children, the most treasured holiday surprise was simple: an orange, a shiny red apple, or a handful of nuts. Exotic and sweet, an orange in winter was a marvel. It had traveled far, smelled like sunshine, and was savored slowly, one juicy segment at a time. These fruits weren't everyday items. Most children in rural towns and farms ate what grew locally and in season. So when an orange appeared in a stocking, it was as if the world itself had reached into their small home and offered them a piece of wonder. Apples were polished to perfection and often nestled alongside candies made from molasses or sugar pulled into shapes. A bright red apple could be as exciting as a toy, especially when money was tight and winter was long. The joy wasn't in quantity, it was in meaning. A single sweet treat showed care, effort, and thoughtfulness. It was a holiday built not on abundance but on appreciation, and the magic of receiving something truly special, even if it fit in the palm of a child's hand. Not every child in the 1800s received a pile of presents on Christmas morning. In fact, most received just one, maybe two, small, meaningful gifts. A penny tucked into a woolen sock, a new ribbon for a girl's hair, or a handmade toy carved from wood could be enough to light up a child's whole day. For some, that penny meant independence, a rare chance to buy a piece of candy or a small trinket at the general store. A new ribbon, bright and colorful, might be the only new adornment a girl received all winter. These gifts weren't just about play, they were tokens of love, thought, and sacrifice. In families where money was tight, and it often was, homemade gifts were treasured most. A parent might stay up late carving a whistle, knitting mittens, or sewing a cloth doll. The joy came not from what was given, but from knowing someone had spent time and care making it. On Christmas morning, children would run to the hearth, feel the weight of their stockings, and find a surprise tucked inside. It wasn't grand, but it was magical, and often those tiny gifts were remembered for a lifetime. In the 1800s, the parlor was the heart of formality, a sacred space where guests were received, introductions were made, and manners were on full display. Unlike today's open-concept living rooms filled with everyday clutter and casual conversations, the parlor was kept spotless, orderly, and often slightly cold, both in temperature and tone. It was the best room in the house, usually reserved for company. The furniture might be stiff and uncomfortable, but it was elegant, perhaps covered in lace doilies or wrapped in protective cloth. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, and a Bible or family album often lay on the center table. When visitors came calling, especially suitors, they were led into the parlor under close supervision. Every word spoken was measured, every gesture noticed. A young lady never sat too close, and hands were kept firmly in laps. The parlor was where engagements were hinted at, condolences delivered, and reputations shaped. Children were rarely allowed inside unless perfectly behaved, and even then, only briefly. It wasn't just a room, it was a stage, and in the 1800s, a well-kept parlor said everything about the family who lived beyond its double doors. Before phones or texts, social interaction in the 1800s was a quiet, deliberate dance, and calling cards were its graceful steps. Every respectable home had a tray near the entrance, ready to receive small, neatly printed cards left by visitors. These cards weren't just for names, they spoke volumes in silence. A man or woman would visit a friend or acquaintance, hand a card to a servant, and leave. If the recipient was home, the visitor might be invited in for tea. If not, the card itself was a message. I was here. I thought of you. There were unwritten rules to it all. A corner turned down meant a personal visit had been attempted. A card sent by mail might be taken as a slight. Returning a card too quickly could appear over, waiting too long, disrespectful. For young women, a gentleman's calling card was often the first quiet step in courtship. Mothers watched closely which names appeared and which were quietly discarded. In this elegant exchange, entire relationships could be formed, maintained, or ended, all without a word. In the world of the 1800s, even silence had social rules. In the 1800s, the simple act of touching someone's bare hand could carry enormous weight. Physical contact between unmarried men and women was strictly limited by custom and propriety, so when a gloved hand met another in a dance or a handshake, it spoke volumes. Gloves were more than a fashion accessory. They were a shield, a boundary, and a signal of status. A well-dressed woman never left home without them. They protected not only her skin but her reputation. In high society, a gentleman might kiss a lady's gloved hand in greeting, a gesture full of respect and subtle admiration. But to touch skin, that was intimate, reserved, even scandalous, if done too boldly. It's why so many love stories of the time hinge on the brush of fingers during a dance, or the moment gloves were removed. Courtship was slow, and every glance, word, and gesture carried meaning. So when a glove came off, revealing a bare wrist, a gentle hand, it wasn't just practical, it was intentional, vulnerable. In a world where modesty ruled and emotions were carefully concealed, the quiet electricity of a gloved touch could say what words dared not. In the 1800s, falling in love was never a private affair. Courtship was a community event, carefully observed, cautiously approved, and always chaperoned. A young woman was free to spend time alone with a man unless marriage was clearly on the horizon. Instead, every conversation, stroll, or shared glance happened under the watchful eye of a family member, friend, or more often her mother. Courting didn't begin with flirting or texting. It began with formal introductions, a calling card, and polite conversation over tea. If the man was deemed suitable, he might be invited to Sunday dinner, but even then, he sat at the table with the entire family, not alone by candlelight. Walks were a common courting ritual, but only during daylight, and always accompanied by a chaperone trailing just far enough behind to offer a bit of space, yet close enough to hear every word. It wasn't about control. It was about reputation, trust, and tradition. A woman's virtue was her future, and any misstep even imagined could ruin it. In that careful dance of glances and guarded words, love still bloomed, slowly, sweetly, and often lastingly. In the structured, polite world of the 1800s, the dance floor offered a rare escape, a place where hands could meet, eyes could lock, and hearts could whisper without saying a word. Balls and formal dances were some of the only socially acceptable ways for young men and women to interact, outside the watchful boundaries of home. The moment the music began, rules shifted just a little. With gloved hands, partners would meet bowing, curtsying, and joining in rhythm. Dances like the waltz, quadrille, and polka were choreographed rituals, where each step carried a message. A slight squeeze of the hand, a smile, a lingering gaze. These were love letters written in movement. But even here, etiquette reigned. A lady could not dance too often with the same gentleman without raising eyebrows. Every invitation was a risk and a compliment. For many, that single dance was the beginning. Afterward, they might wait days for a calling card or walk past one another in town, stealing glances filled with unspoken hope. On the dance floor, in a world of rules and roles, something tender was allowed to stir. And for a few minutes under candlelight and music, love was allowed to breathe. In the 1800s, when a woman said, "I do," she didn't just give her heart, she surrendered her independence. Under most legal systems of the time, particularly in Europe and America, a married woman's identity was legally absorbed into her husband's. This doctrine, known as coverture, meant that her property, earnings, and even inherited wealth became his the moment vows were exchanged. A woman who came into marriage with land, livestock, or a dowry had no legal right to control it afterward. Her husband could sell it, spend it, or manage it as he pleased, often without consulting her. If he died, the law might allow her to keep a portion as a widow's share, but it was far from guaranteed. Even her children, by law, belonged to him. If a couple separated or divorced, an extremely rare and scandalous event, the father almost always retained custody, regardless of the circumstances. Some women, aware of these risks, tried to protect their futures through prenuptial agreements or by keeping property in a brother's or father's name. But for many, marriage meant giving up everything but their role as wife and mother. It was love, yes, but also a legal surrender wrapped in lace. In the 1800s, a woman stepping outside without her bonnet and gloves was like someone today showing up barefoot in a business meeting. Unthinkable and certainly scandalous. These accessories weren't just fashion statements. They were symbols of dignity, modesty, and social awareness. To be properly dressed meant being properly respected. The bonnet was more than a hat. It framed the face, shielded the skin from the sun, and often indicated a woman's age, marital status, or wealth. Young girls wore soft fabric bonnets tied under the chin, while married women might don wider-brimmed styles adorned with lace, flowers, or ribbons, but its main purpose was to signal virtue. A covered head meant a proper woman. Gloves served a similar role. They protected a lady's hands from sun and labor, but also from the impropriety of bare skin. Gloves were worn in church, at dances, and even while shopping. A handshake, if it happened, was done gloved. Even in summer's heat, these layers were kept in place. To be caught without them, even for a quick errand, could draw judgmental eyes and whispered disapproval. In a world of unspoken rules, a bonnet and gloves weren't just fashion, they were a shield. In the 1800s, an umbrella wasn't something you kept folded in your bag just in case. It was a prized possession, often expensive, and treated with the kind of care reserved for heirlooms. Most people didn't own one at all. In fact, seeing someone walk by with an umbrella, especially a woman, was a subtle sign of social status and privilege. For the average family, when it rained, you simply got wet. Men might wear oilskin coats or wide-brimmed hats. Women pulled their shawls tighter and quickened their pace. Roads turned to mud, hymns became soaked, and shoes squelched. But if you were fortunate enough to own an umbrella made from oiled silk and a sturdy carved handle, you had shelter from the storm and a quiet badge of refinement. Parasols, on the other hand, were more common, especially among women in sunny climates. These dainty accessories weren't for rain but for shade, designed to protect pale skin from the sun. A fair complexion was associated with gentility, while a tan hinted at outdoor labor. So whether it was to keep dry or stay pale, an umbrella or parasol wasn't just practical, it was a symbol, a small piece of everyday elegance in a world of harsh weather and harder work. In the 1800s, beauty wasn't bronze, it was pale, deliberately pale. A fair complexion wasn't just a fashion preference, it was a quiet declaration of class. Pale skin meant you didn't have to work outside, that your hands weren't calloused by sun and soil, and that you lived a life of refinement and leisure. Women went to great lengths to protect their skin from tanning. Parasols were carried on sunny walks, bonnets were worn with wide brims, and gloves extended to the elbow in summer. Some even applied powders and lotions made from lead or arsenic, unaware of the dangers, all to maintain that coveted porcelain glow. Freckles, tans, and sunburns were seen as flaws, signs of a working woman or a farm girl. In contrast, The smooth white face of a lady spoke volumes without saying a word. Men, too, noticed. Poems were written about ivory skin and cheeks like snow, and in portraits, skin was often lightened deliberately. In a world where class wasn't always spoken aloud, appearance became the language, and pale skin carefully preserved, sometimes dangerously achieved, was more than beauty. It was proof that your life happened indoors, far from the harshness of the working world. In the 1800s, a quilting bee wasn't just about sewing. It was a gathering of hands, hearts, and stories. Women would come together, sometimes from miles around, carrying scraps of fabric, baskets of food, and babies on their hips. They'd settle into chairs around a large quilt frame, thread their needles, and begin to stitch. Not just patterns, but community. Quilting was practical. Yes, a way to make warm bedding for cold winters, wedding gifts, or baby blankets, but it was also deeply social. As the women worked, they shared news, recipes, worries, and laughter. They talked about births and losses, about whose cow got loose and which neighbor had a secret. The rhythm of the needle became the backdrop to their connection. Young girls watched and learned. Older women passed down both techniques and wisdom. Some quilts told stories, with each patch representing a memory, a person, or a place. Others were simply beautiful, stitched with love and care. By the end of the day, the quilt might not be finished, but hearts were often lighter. In a world where women's lives could be isolating, quilting bees offered something rare, warmth not just for the bed, but for the soul. In the 1800s, families were large, not by fashion, but by necessity. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to bear 8, 10, or even 12 children over her lifetime. Children meant help on the farm, care in old age, and the continuation of the family name. But with each birth came enormous risk and incredible strength. Most births didn't happen in hospitals. They happened at home, in bedrooms dimly lit by oil lamps, surrounded by familiar walls and worried relatives. And more often than not, it was a midwife, not a doctor, who guided new life into the world. Midwives were trusted women in the community, experienced and steady. They carried no machines, no monitors, only towels, hot water, herbal remedies, and wisdom learned through decades of helping mothers before. Sometimes they rode through snowstorms to reach a birth on time. Pain relief was minimal. There were no epidurals, no heart monitors, only grit, prayer, and a strong grip of a loved one. And when the baby finally cried, the whole house seemed to exhale. It was a moment of joy, relief, and often mourning. Because not every birth ended with a cry, but every one began with hope. In the 1800s, joy and sorrow often arrived in the same cradle. For all the love poured into welcoming a new life, the reality was harsh. Many babies didn't survive past their first year. Diseases like measles, cholera, and whooping cough spread quickly, and medical care was limited. Even something as simple as a fever could become deadly. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Families braced themselves with every pregnancy, holding hope in one hand and fear in the other. A mother might bury more than one child in her lifetime. Sometimes, small wooden markers stood in the yard, quiet reminders of lives that barely had time to begin. But grief, in those days, was private. Mothers were expected to carry on, to care for the rest of the household. Even while their hearts ached, they might sew a tiny dress that was never worn, or keep a lock of hair tucked in the family Bible. Some families named children after lost siblings, a way of keeping memory alive. Others never spoke of it again because the pain was too deep. Behind every big family photo from the past is a story of loss, strength, and the silent courage it took to keep loving anyway. In the 1800s, when a woman lost her husband, the world expected her to wear her grief, literally. Widows dressed in mourning black, not for weeks or months, but often for years. In some cases, especially among the deeply traditional or upper classes, they wore black for the rest of their lives. The mourning dress wasn't just about color, it was a uniform of sorrow, modest, heavy, and devoid of any frills or joy. Black veils covered faces. Jewelry worn at all was often made from jet, a glossy black stone, or incorporated a lock of the deceased's hair into brooches, rings, or lockets. The first year was considered deep mourning, and during this time, the widow withdrew from social events, wore only black, and lived quietly. Gradually, if permitted by custom or circumstance, she could move into half mourning, which allowed for greys, lavenders, and subdued patterns. But even after the dress was put away, the grief often lingered. For many women, a husband's death meant not just emotional loss, but financial and social uncertainty. Still, they pressed on, raising children, running farms, managing households, all while cloaked in the quiet dignity of their sorrow. In the 1800s, death didn't happen behind hospital curtains or in sterile funeral homes. It happened at home, quietly, intimately, and was mourned right there in the front parlor. When a loved one passed, the body was washed and dressed by family members or neighbors. The parlor, usually reserved for visitors and formal occasions, was transformed into a space of farewell. The deceased was laid out in their best clothes, often in a simple pine casket or sometimes just wrapped in a burial shroud. Flowers were placed nearby, not just for beauty, but to mask the scent of death. Mirrors were often covered, and clocks stopped at the hour of death. Superstitions, yes, but also ways to mark the passage between life and what lay beyond. Friends and family came to pay respects, bringing food, prayers, and quiet comfort. Children were not shielded from it. They stood beside their parents, learning early that death was part of life. The burial might happen the next day, with the coffin transported by wagon and followed by mourners on foot. There were tears, hymns, and handkerchiefs, but also resilience. In a world where death came often, the rituals of grief helped people carry on. In the 1800s, photographs were rare and expensive, taken only on the most significant occasions. For many families, especially those of modest means, a photograph might be taken just once in a lifetime, and tragically, sometimes that one photo was taken only after death. Post-mortem photography, as it was called, became a tender ritual during the Victorian era. When a child or loved one passed away, families would dress them in their best clothing, arrange them carefully, and pose them for a photograph. Sometimes the deceased were laid in a crib or seated in a favorite chair. Their eyes were closed peacefully, or, in some cases, carefully painted open after the photo was developed to mimic life. Living family members would gather around, holding the hand of the departed or gently resting a palm on their shoulder. These photos were not morbid, they were sacred. They captured the only remaining image of someone deeply loved. People placed these portraits in lockets, framed them on walls, or tucked them into family Bibles. They were not just mementos, they were farewells frozen in time, a last, fragile attempt to hold on to someone who had already slipped quietly beyond the veil. In the 1800s, a lock of hair wasn't just a sentimental token, it was a deeply personal keepsake, a tangible piece of someone you loved, lost, or longed for. Before photographs were common, and before phone calls could carry a voice across miles, people used hair as a way to remember to feel closer, even after separation or death. Young sweethearts often exchanged locks tied with ribbon, storing them in lockets or envelopes scented with perfume. A mother might save a soft curl from her baby's first haircut, or a wife might keep a snip of her husband's hair when he went off to war. But the most poignant use of hair came after death. Mourning jewelry, rings, brooches, and pendants was often made using the hair of the deceased. Artists wove strands into intricate patterns and set them beneath glass or into ivory. Some even created entire framed artworks, weeping willows, urns, or trees crafted from hair, beads, and silk thread. To us, it may seem strange, but to them, it was sacred. Hair did not decay like flesh, it endured, and in that permanence, grieving hearts found comfort, a small, enduring reminder that love, like hair, can remain long after goodbye. In the 1800s, the family Bible was more than a religious book. It was a sacred archive, a storyteller, and a silent witness to generations of life. Resting on a special shelf or a table in the parlor, it was often the largest and most valuable book in the home, passed down from parents to children like a treasured heirloom. But its value wasn't just in the words of scripture. Inside the front and back pages were handwritten records, births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, carefully penned in ink, sometimes with trembling hands. Names were added with pride, sorrow, or joy. Dates were circled, underlined, or decorated. These pages told the family's story in a way that no photograph ever could. Pressed between the Bible's thick pages were often more treasures: a dried flower from a wedding bouquet, a child's drawing, a lock of hair, or a yellowed obituary cut from the local paper. Some families wrote prayers, poems, or little notes to God, deeply personal confessions tucked between sacred verses. Reading from the Bible was a daily ritual for many, and gathering around it on Sundays was a moment of stillness. It wasn't just a book, it was the heart of the home and the keeper of its memory. In the 1800s, literacy wasn't something everyone had, but those who could read often read aloud, not just for education, but for connection. In the evenings, after the supper dishes were cleared and the fire rekindled, families would gather together. The reader, usually a parent or the eldest child, would open a worn book, a newspaper, or the family Bible and begin to speak. It wasn't just about stories, it was a ritual of togetherness. As the words flowed, children listened wide-eyed, younger ones drifting to sleep in laps, older ones knitting or whittling as they followed the tale. For many, it was the only entertainment of the day, a chance to journey far beyond the Farmore village without ever leaving the room. News from the outside world arrived in printed form, read aloud for those who couldn't decipher the letters themselves. Novels brought laughter, tears, and adventure. Scripture offered comfort and poetry. That was music for the soul. In a world without screens, this was how hearts were touched, minds were stirred, and bonds were quietly deepened. The voice of a loved one reading by firelight, that was the soundtrack of evening in the 1800s. In the 1800s, a schoolhouse was rarely more than a single-room wooden walls, a slate roof, and rows of benches worn smooth by generations of restless legs. Within that one room, a single teacher taught children of all ages, from the youngest who could barely hold a chalk stick to teenagers preparing for the wider world. There were no grade levels, no standardized tests, and often no desks, just shared long tables or laps used as writing surfaces. The teacher, usually a young, unmarried woman, rang the bell each morning, and students walked miles in snow, rain, or blazing sun just to sit and learn. Lessons included reading, arithmetic, penmanship, and moral instruction. Older students helped the younger ones. Recitation was the norm, standing tall and proud to speak your sums or read aloud from the McGuffey reader. Heat came from a wood stove, and bathrooms were outhouses out back. Supplies were few, but discipline was firm. A dunce cap and a scolding could greet a wandering mind, and yet those little schoolhouses lit countless minds. They stood as beacons of possibility, quiet rooms where, with grit and guidance, the children of farmers, blacksmiths, and seamstresses began to dream. In the 1800s, the schoolteacher was a figure of quiet authority, respected, expected to set a moral example, and often paid less than a laborer. Most teachers in rural communities were unmarried women, barely older than their oldest students, sent to live with local families or in simple boarding houses while they taught. Her days began early. Before the bell rang, she'd light the stove, sweep the floor, and prepare the day's lessons, all written by hand. She might teach 20 students or 50, all in one room, all at different levels. Patience wasn't optional, it was survival. Beyond reading and arithmetic, she was tasked with shaping character. She enforced silence, discipline, and Christian values. Any hint of impropriety, a raised voice, an overly friendly smile could ruin her reputation and her job. If she chose to marry, she often had to resign. Teaching was seen as a calling for the pure and unattached. Despite the challenges, many taught with passion. They inspired curiosity in young minds, gave hope to poor families, and brought books to places where few had time to read. In a time when women had few paths of independence, the teacher lit candles in the darkness quietly, bravely, and without applause. In the 1800s, discipline in school was strict, not just firm, but physical. Education was seen as a privilege, and with it came a strong belief that order must be maintained. Teachers, often alone in a classroom filled with squirming children of all ages, relied on more than just stern words to keep the room quiet. A misbehaving student might feel the sharp sting of a wooden ruler across their knuckles, a quick, painful reminder to behave. Talking out of turn, fidgeting, or forgetting a lesson could earn a scolding or worse. In many schools, the infamous dunce cap waited in the corner, pointed in white. It was placed on the head of a child who had failed to answer correctly or follow directions, forcing them to sit on a stool before their peers in silent humiliation. Though harsh by modern standards, this was considered normal. The goal wasn't just to teach facts, it was to instill discipline, obedience, and humility. Yet, behind every stern correction, many teachers still cared deeply. They wanted their students to succeed, to rise above the dirt roads and wooden desks. And so, with ruler in one hand and hope in the other, they kept teaching. In the 1800s, education wasn't equal, it was divided by expectation. Boys were prepared for business, farming, or trades. Girls were prepared for marriage. Even in the same one-room schoolhouse, the lessons given and the skills praised often followed the quiet script of gender roles. Boys studied arithmetic, reading, geography, and if their schooling continued subjects like history or Latin, they were encouraged to speak clearly, write boldly, and be curious about the wider world. They were the future leaders, shopkeepers, preachers, and farmers. Girls, on the other hand, learned their letters and numbers too, but they were also expected to master sewing, mending, cooking, and proper penmanship. Teachers praised neatness, gentleness, and obedience. A girl who could embroider a sampler with her alphabet and a Bible verse was considered with. For many girls, school ended earlier than for boys. They were needed at home or expected to marry young. But some, quietly and bravely, kept reading by candlelight long after chores were done, holding on to stories, dreams, and the hope of something more. In every schoolroom, behind every chalkboard and slate, there were not just lessons but limitations, and yet many found ways to learn beyond them. In the 1800s, being left-handed wasn't seen as unique, it was seen as wrong. Teachers believed the correct writing hand was the right one, and many worked hard, sometimes harshly, to force children to switch. To write with the left was to challenge order, to stand out, and in some eyes, to disobey. Children who naturally reached for their pencil or slate with their left hand were quickly. Their left hands might be tied behind their backs, slapped with a ruler, or simply scolded over and over. Parents supported this, not out of cruelty, but because society linked left-handedness with clumsiness, bad manners, even bad luck. In some cultures and communities, the left hand was associated with darkness, sin, or even witchcraft. Right was not just about direction, it meant proper, moral, and respectable. And so, many children learned to stifle their instincts. They practiced endlessly with their non-dominant hand, struggling through shaky letters and sore wrists. Some never returned to their natural preference. Others, once grown, quietly reclaimed it. In the end, what was lost wasn't just ease, it was identity. All because the world around them insisted that different wasn't just unusual, it was unacceptable. In the 1800s, Sundays were sacred not just for worship, but for rest. After 6 days of back-breaking work, early mornings, and endless chores, Sunday arrived like a soft exhale. Shops closed, tools were put away, and even the most restless hands paused. It wasn't a day for productivity, it was a day for the soul. Most families began Sunday with church. Dressed in their cleanest clothes, they walked or rode in silence, hats tipped, gloves buttoned. The church bell echoed across hills and valleys, calling everyone from farmers to merchants to gather and reflect. But after the sermon, Sundays didn't rush. They unfolded slowly. Families returned home to share a meal, sometimes simple, sometimes special, and then settled into quiet. Children might read Bible stories aloud. Elders might share tales from their youth. Some rested, heads nodding by the hearth, while others took long walks through fields, whispering prayers or enjoying the stillness. There were no chores, no loud laughter, no unnecessary movement. Even games were subdued. It was a day apart from the world's noise, a weekly reminder to be still, to listen, and to breathe. In that hush, something sacred stirred, not just faith, but peace. In the 1800s, snow meant more than just cold, it meant adventure. When winter blanketed the hills in white and chores were done, children raced outside to make the most of it. Without factory-made sleds or plastic they used whatever they could find. Wooden barrel staves, tin baking pans, even old shovel heads, anything that would slide down a snowy hill. Laughter echoed across the frozen fields as children clambered up and flew down again, red-cheeked and breathless. Mittens were often mismatched or handmade, and boots were sometimes just shoes lined with extra wool. Snow crept through sleeves and collars, but the cold couldn't dim their joy. In towns, sledding down main roads was common before horses and carriages arrived. Parents watched from windows, smiling. For those near frozen ponds, ice skating became another winter pastime, sometimes with real skates, sometimes with nothing more than smooth shoes and steady balance. There were no video games, no flashing lights, just snowflakes in the hair, steam rising from mouths, and the thrill of speed. Winter, even in its harshest hours, offered a kind of freedom, and 4 children in the 1800s, that was magic enough.